Good morning. It's a great day out there again today. So welcome to Wild Rose this morning, this beloved community who seek to welcome and embody the welcome of Jesus. No matter who you are and where you've been and who you love, this is the place for you. You really need to know that you matter. This land was not always our land, and before us there were people known as the First Nations people. We acknowledge their heritage and their presence even now and give thanks that we now journey together to try and find a rightful place for all of us living on the Creator's land. And now I think Dan and Diane are going to light our Christ candle.
The world is a confusing place. Things are constantly changing, and we're unsure of our path. May the light from this Christ candle remind us of the unwavering light of Christ that can show us the way. Please join me in the bold responses. We are called to follow Jesus, but sometimes we don't feel up to the task. We are called to follow Jesus, but we're not sure we know the way. Let us gather together in this sacred space and reconnect to the source of life. May we be reminded of what is really important and renew our faith journey with hope and love.
Please stand if you're able and willing to join with us for Voices United number 660, How Firm a Foundation.
Shake, I'll Good morning. I'm Barbara Grant, and it's my pleasure to do family time this morning. I was telling Mark, our visiting minister, that I have a trilogy of 3 tearjerkers, but I've only been asked to do it for 2 Sundays, so you'll have to wait for the 3rd tearjerker. So this is the story of Love You Forever. Maybe many of you remember it when you were a young mother reading it to your children. I wasn't sure how I was going to introduce this story, but then I opened the book, and it says, "Dearest Mark, Mila, and Michael." They are my adult children now. "In memoriam to my father and your granddad, October the 4th, 1916 to November 25th, 1987. And I wrote these words. These were difficult words for my father to speak, but I know that he felt them in his heart. Our need is to articulate these feelings one to the other and to pass them onward from this generation to the next. Learn to express your feelings straight, and you will always be taken care of."
Love You Forever, written by Robert Munch, illustrated by Sheila McGraw. A mother held her new baby and very slowly rocked him back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And while she held him, she sang, "I'll love you forever, I'll like you for always, as long as I'm living, my baby you'll be." The baby grew. He grew and he grew and he grew. He grew until he was 2 years old, and he ran all around the house. He pulled all the books off the shelves. He pulled all the food out of the refrigerator, and he took his mother's watch and flushed it down the toilet. Sometimes his mother would say, "This kid is driving me crazy." But at nighttime, when that 2-year-old was quiet, she opened the door to his room, crawled across the floor, looked up over the side of his bed, and if he was really asleep, she picked him up and rocked him back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. While she rocked him, she sang, "I'll love you forever, I'll like you for always, as long as I'm living, my baby you'll be." The little boy grew. He grew and he grew and he grew. He grew until he was 9 years old. And he never wanted to come in for dinner. He never wanted to take a bath. And when Grandma visited, he always said bad words. Sometimes his mother wanted to sell him to the zoo. But at nighttime, when he was asleep, the mother quietly opened the door to his room, crawled across the floor, and looked up over the side of the bed. If he was really asleep, she picked up that 9-year-old boy and rocked him back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And while she rocked him, she sang, "I'll love you forever, I'll like you for always, as long as I'm living, my baby you'll be." The boy grew. He grew and he grew and he grew. He grew until he was a teenager. He had strange friends, and he wore strange clothes, and he listened to strange music. Sometimes the mother felt like she was in a zoo. But at nighttime, when that teenager was asleep, the mother opened the door to his room, crawled across the floor, and looked up over the side of the bed. If he was really asleep, she picked up that great big boy and rocked him back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. While she rocked him, she sang, "I'll love you forever, I'll like you for always, as long as I'm living, my baby you'll be." That teenager grew. He grew and he grew and he grew. He grew until he was a grown-up man. He left home and got a house across town. But sometimes, on dark nights, the mother got into her car and drove across town. If all the lights in her son's house were out, she opened his bedroom window, crawled across the floor, and looked up over the side of his bed. If that great big man was really asleep, she picked him up and rocked him back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And while she rocked him, she sang, "I'll love you forever, I'll like you for always. As long as I'm living, my baby you'll be. Well, that mother, she got older. She got older and older and older. One day, she called up her son and said, "You'd better come see me because I'm very old and sick." So her son came to see her. When he came in the door, she tried to sing the song. She sang, "I'll love you forever, I'll like you for always." But she couldn't finish because she was too old and sick. The son went to his mother. He picked her up and rocked her back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And he sang this song, "I'll love you forever, I'll like you for always. As long as I'm living, my mommy you'll be." When the son came home that night, he stood for a long time at the top of the stairs. Then he went into the room where his very new baby daughter was sleeping. He picked her up in his arms and very slowly rocked her back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And while he rocked her, he sang, "I'll love you forever, I'll like you for always. As long as I'm living, my baby you'll be." Thanks for watching. Please subscribe if you haven't already.
Well, I'm not sure I could do the latter thing. This is the story of how that little boy goes through the stages of childhood and becomes a man. It's also about the enduring nature of parents' love and how it crosses generations. Love You Forever is a book that both children and adults will enjoy over and over again.
Peace emerges where justice exists, where those who have much do not have too much, and those that have little do not have too little, where the vulnerable are supported and all can participate in the goodness of life. As we light this candle, let us seek that peace. Please join me in the reading of this Cheyenne prayer. For as long as the moon shall rise, for as long as the rivers shall flow, for as long as the sun shall shine, for as long as the grass shall grow, let us know peace. And there's still there's at least, there's one peace candle here yet. If anyone wishes to take one home or to take it to another church if they're traveling, that's how we move this from church to church. And now I think Mark is going to, oh no, we're going to do Pass the Peace, sorry. It's up there. May the peace of Christ be with you, also with you. Please greet one another.
Please join us, if you can, rise, and we're going to sing Jesus Laughed Out Loud, More Voices 133. Jesus laughed out loud to see the children play. His joyful presence drew a crowd, could not stand away. Jesus healed a child by asking her to rise, and doubtful people wept and smiled to see her open eyes. Jesus felt the need. We made the crowd sit down. A boy had faith and all were fed. We were far from a town. Jesus climbed a hill to pray and rest alone. We wondered why we felt the chill of wind and wood and stone. Jesus called my name when he was passing by. My life will never be the same. This love will never die.
Our scripture reading this morning continues from our passage from last week, reading in Matthew 14, verses 22 to 33. Again, I'll be reading from the First Nations version. Right away, Creator sets free, that is Jesus, had his followers get into the canoe and go ahead of him to the other side of the great lake, while he sent the people back to their homes. After that, he went up to the mountainside to be alone while he sent his voice to the Great Spirit. He stayed there and prayed as the sun set and the stars came out. His followers were still in the canoe, far from land. The wind blew strong against them, and the waves pounded the canoe and began to toss it about. Late into the night, just before the morning light, Creator sets free came near to them, walking on the water. When his followers saw him, they cried out in terror, "Is it a ghost spirit?" But he heard their cries and called out to them, "Do not fear, take heart, it is I." "Wisdom keeper, is it you who stands on the rock?" Peter shouted back to him. "If so, tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said to him without any hesitation. With reckless abandon, stands on the rock climbed over the side of the canoe and began to walk on the water toward him. The wind howled, and the waves splash against him as he made his way toward Creator Sets Free. But when he felt how strong the wind was, fear took hold of him. He began to sink and cried out, "Wisdom keeper, save me." Creator Sets Free quickly reached out and took hold of him. "Man of small faith," he said, "what made you hold back and doubt me?" The wind stopped blowing and the waves grew still as they climbed into the canoe. All 12 of his message bearers gave honor to him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of the Great Spirit." Scripture is our song for the journey.
God calls us to be doers of the word and not hearers only.
There are some passages that after I read them and before I begin to preach, sometimes just bring a smile to my face because I know you appreciate what goes into creating a sermon, but sometimes it's more difficult. Sometimes there are passages that we read in church, and one can only shake one's head sometimes and wonder, what am I going to do with this? Today borderlines on that story. So I offer this to you as a meditation on what do we do with the story that follows the feeding of the 5,000 or 25,000, whatever it was. And we have this context of following Jesus through his travels through Matthew. So I want to ask you, have you ever been in a situation where you heard a story or a joke and you didn't get it? I'm there a lot. Either you've totally missed the point of the story, or the punchline of the joke made absolutely no sense to you. You found yourself to be the only one not laughing at the joke, or you got distracted with a minor point of the story and missed the main one. There are times, indeed, that we can miss the point of the story. There are times that we can be totally baffled by the details and not get the meaning at all. Sometimes the expectations that we bring to a story when we're listening to a story help muddle our understanding of it. That is where I'm at personally, what's happening in my life, the things that I'm stressed about, the things that I've got left to do, yet have made the time to come and hear a story. But I'm still thinking of all of those other things that I should be doing or must do when I'm done listening to the story. Last week, I tried to bring us back to the consciousness, our modern consciousness, to an understanding of miracle that we no longer have. Because today we define miracle as some kind of divine intervention into the world that breaks some kind of law of nature. But our ancient ancestors didn't have that definition of what a miracle, what a wonder was. Those that witnessed such events that occurred and made them pause to wonder and perhaps even smile because of what happened, weren't tied up with definitional problems, with ideological differences, or impossibilities. They were well aware that it was impossible, but there they were. They're listening to the story, and it happened. And while we hear that there are miracle stories today in our modern understanding, we bring expectations as to what those stories are meant to mean or convey and what it asks of us as hearers of those stories. And that complicates it for us to hear perhaps the main point. There are other stories, though, that sound like miracle stories, but end up being something else. One set of those stories we might call legend stories. These are stories that we expect to hear because of what we know about the individual who's the subject of the story. For example, knowing that we're in the middle of Matthew and he's telling us the good news about Jesus Christ, there's something that involves the revelation of what it means to call Jesus the Christ, the expectations of what it means to be the Messiah that we look for and wait to hear for as the story unfolds. Indeed, one of those expectations of the Messiah is that he will perform deeds of power and impress us with his actions and his teachings. But there are also other things that we might expect on account of him also being called the Son of God, who somehow participates in the divinity of God that he talks about. These expectations are met by hearing stories that confirm his divine participation. In the ancient world, two such confirmations would be being born of a virgin and walking on water. There is also contained in Matthew's purpose for writing his version of the story that the reader or hearers of his good news would find the fulfillment of a promise that was announced at Jesus' birth, that he is somehow Emmanuel. He will show us what it means that God is with us. And there is something that we will experience in that presence of the divine with us here and now, and not as a future anticipation of some other realm or some other place or some other thing that will happen. Regardless of what is happening now, the promise is that we will experience Emmanuel. That is a difficult one to fulfill on. Today's story then seems to be more in line with these ideas of a legend story, confirming Jesus' identity. Just as I mentioned that of a miracle story that give us reason to wonder or to be surprised by the identity of Jesus. So, a long introduction. I apologize for that. But let's look at today's story. This story occurs in 3 of the Gospels. Unlike last week's, which occurred in all 4 Gospels, this one occurs in only 3. Now, usually when a story occurs in the 3 Gospels, we know probably Matthew, Mark, and Luke have a version of it. However, Luke doesn't have a version of this story, but John does. It's not often that John and Matthew and Mark agree on the order or on the story, but this is one time that they do. Matthew's version, though not the oldest, is the longest, and there are 2 major differences about the story that Matthew has it that we don't find in Mark's story or in John's story. One, Peter tries to walk on the water. That only happens in Matthew's version. Secondly, only in this story does it end with a kind of worship affirmation that Jesus is God's Son. That doesn't happen in the other version. And we kind of think it might happen in John, because that's kind of central to John's story. But no, it happens only in Matthew. So Peter walks on water. Jesus is identified or confessed as God's Son. And what we have in all 3 stories, of course, is this idea of fear, of the boat and the storm, and being shocked to see Jesus walking on water. Matthew is the only one also that adds this sense of doubt that occurs in Peter's mind, which I think enables the disciples and us as readers to find Emmanuel. One commentator, just to talk about the walking on water as a feature of what we'd expect as somebody divine or a son of God, one commentator summarizes walking on water in the ancient Mediterranean world in this way. In antiquity, walking on water was of great interest to people. It happened as a dream, a fascinating idea. It is impossible for human beings and is reserved only for God, unless humans are in special ways sons of gods or achieve divine powers by magic, or unless in their audacity they invade dimensions that are reserved for the divine. Thus, it is rather clear in what categories the first readers and hearers must have interpreted Jesus' walk on water, and then also Peter's. We should point out also that there are cultures in India where there are also numerous parallels. The borders between the divine and the human are fluid in a quite different way. Some other observations. The 4th watch of the night, that early light, occurs sometime between 3 and 6 a.m. It is also the biblical time of God's helpful intervention. And for Christians, it is the time of the resurrection of Jesus. We must also not lose meaning in the translation of the Greek words, particularly one phrase I want to hold up for you. The words Jesus uses here to identify himself. He says, "It is I." In Greek, this is ego eimi. I know it's really important. But these words, that phrase, is also found in the Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures that we call the Septuagint. And it's found in a very important passage in Exodus where Moses is standing at the burning bush and asks the divine or the burning bush to identify itself. And in Greek, it's ego eimi. Ego eimi, it is I, is the Greek translation of that longer phrase and complicated phrase that we normally translate from the Hebrew, I am who I am, or I will be who I will be. And interestingly, ego eimi is also the source of all of John's sayings in his gospel that begin with I am. The Good Shepherd, the gate, the door. All of those I am stories begin with ego eimi. So this phrase is an important phrase. And in English, it's so easy for us to lose what those textual connections are. I feel it's worth pointing out to you. We also notice that the boat or the canoe, as it's read in the First Nations version, the Greek word is tortured by the waves. This word torture connotes the idea of human suffering. Water, storm, and night are symbols of distress, fear, and death, familiar to the church and the Hebrew tradition as well, because these images are very common in our Psalms. But what seems to come first in the story is fear. The storm has unleashed, and fear is the result. The disciples are fearing for their lives. After being trained and commissioned at the feeding of the 5,000 and being told to go, and Jesus will join them later, the disciples set off in the boat for the other side. However, as reality sets in that the journey will take longer than anticipated, that the work will be harder than was planned and thought, and that it will not be clear sailing, fear sets in when it becomes difficult. This sounds more like the beginning of a new church stewardship program, doesn't it? We're all committed to do something we know will bring good results as long as it doesn't get too difficult. At this point, even the presence of Jesus, even Jesus showing up, doesn't take away the fear. The fear of the storm, of the threat that it brings, or the bubbling up of insecurity of the disciples in the boat. But Peter, the impulsive one, Peter, the one who's always to jump first, says, "Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come and I will. This is a great idea. Let's do it." But he too begins to walk on water. This is something that we don't expect as readers. That is, he begins to walk on water until he loses sight of Jesus and looks at the storm and sees the waves and feels the wind, and he begins to drown, and he calls Jesus to save him. As readers and hearers, we know only too well what has happened to Peter. For we see in ourselves Peter's fear and what threatens him. Things that we fear, like death, like insecurity, unbelief, hostility, sickness, and guilt. We know from our own lives what it is like when all of these things become overpowering, and when looks at the storm ahead and cannot and does not listen to the Lord. These images are open, inviting us to put our own experiences in them. It's as if Matthew is addressing every and each individual Christian aware of the many storms that threaten us. This is more than just a simple journey across the Sea of Galilee. This is a story of Matthew's church. It's a story of Matthew's members and adherents, the ancient Christians, facing all that they had to do in their own lives in the absence of Jesus, who has commissioned them to go forward, and yet they find themselves alone, and it's difficult. Peter's actions show us the risk that comes with and is needed for a life of faith. He represents all Christians, those who dare to believe that somehow God is with us. He represents what it means to be caught midway between belief and doubt. Jesus responds to the little faith of the disciples with words of encouragement. Important for Matthew is that the saving presence of God does not mean that no storms appear, but that one experiences the saving presence in the storms. That's tough for us to believe, because you've probably heard it many times. Well, you know, if you believed enough, the bad things aren't going to happen. But what Matthew is showing for us here is with just a little bit of belief, it doesn't matter what happens, God is with you. Which is a more powerful story and a more inspiring story. Those who risk obedience and move out from their securities run the possibility of experiencing God now. God's help does not mean that faith, bright and unthreatened, eliminates the storms. Again, that needs to be emphasized and recognized by that. Being a Christian is not a walk in the park. History shows us that being a Christian is a commitment to suffering, is a commitment to a journey that is not easy, that is very difficult. Yet we also read from the testament of those that were faithful, had a little bit of faith, that they weren't alone, that God was with them, found indeed the presence of God within them. But that's a story we don't seem to hear enough. And yet here it is in Matthew. The little faith identified here is a mixture of courage and fear, of listening to the Lord and of looking at the wind, of trust and doubt that, according to Matthew, remains a fundamental characteristic of Christian existence. It is not an essential characteristic of faith that doubt is part of faith. It just is the reality. As one philosopher has noticed, faith comes first and doubt comes later. Doubt doesn't arise before there's faith. First we believe, and then we wonder about that belief. Matthew will remind his readers at the end of his gospel that when Jesus appears to his disciples, and these are one of the last words that Matthew leaves with us, he says Jesus appears to the disciples and some of them worshiped, but some of them doubted. But they still listened. They were still present. Our story reports how the Christian, represented by Peter, leaves his boat in a concrete venture of obedience, and alone and unsupported in the water, grows beyond himself and thus experiences both his own failure and the Lord's support. It deals with the possibility of exceeding one's own human limitations in faith in the midst of deep despair, fear, misfortune, suffering, and guilt. The way of Jesus is not just any way. It is the way of love and obedience. We learn when to pray. We learn when to act. We learn that at the darkest point, when all seems lost, hope is possible. We learn that a little faith is enough. We also learn that this way is not a way of bliss or transcendence, but a way of engagement. Matthew tells the story of walking on the water as part of his story of the Son of God, in whom God is with us. He made his way to the other shore in obedience to the will of God, in love and in suffering. This way of the Son of God makes clear in content what Peter's way on the water looks like. It is not just any way. It is the way of love and obedience. As a legend story, this is not merely about what Jesus did then that cannot be repeated now. It is what the Christ, through his Spirit, continues to do with those who have a little faith and comes to those, through those, and face the storms, rather, that come to threaten us. To be sustained by Jesus in the water's abyss does not mean somehow to grow beyond yourself and to have experiences of transcendence. It means to yield to Jesus' way of love, and then, in an abysmally loveless world, to experience being carried by him. It is to experience Emmanuel. God is with us, indeed. Amen.
Please rise if you are able to join us for Jesus Calls Us, number 562 in Voices United. Jesus calls us o'er the tumult of life's wild restless sea. Day by day his clear voice sounding, saying, Christian, follow me. Long ago apostles heard it by the Galilean lake, turned from home and toil and kindred, leaving all for Jesus' sake. Jesus calls us from the worship of the vain world's golden store, from each idol that would keep us, saying, Christian, love me more. In our joys and in our sorrows, days of toil and hours of ease, still he calls us in care measures. Christian, love me more than these. Jesus Jesus calls us by your mercies, Savior, may we hear your call. Give our hearts to your obedience, serve and love you best of all. Please be seated. Let us bow our heads. Healing and loving presence, Father and Mother of us all, be not afraid. Let's remember this week Claude Matou, who is in hospital in the spinal unit at the FMC Center. Let's also remember Linda Ellis, who can't be with us, and she's never not here. So she has to be in isolation because of a treatment she's having this week. Let us also remember in hospital Sue Knapp. Sue Knapp had lung surgery last Thursday, and she is thriving. Can we also remember those who passed this week? From our congregation, Carrie Sorrenti. Carrie was very active in this congregation, and she passed away suddenly this week. Her memorial service will be held this Thursday. Let us also remember Mark Winitsky. That is Kate Reeves' husband. He was very active in Knox Church, not so much in this church, but Kate was a secretary here. Let us also remember our brothers and sisters in the Ukraine. And the words, "Be not afraid," are exemplified in the walking on water that they do daily in order to take the risks that they do just to live in a world of conflict. Let us also give thanks this day for the beautiful sunshine and the wonderful soft rain that fell yesterday on our gardens. We have so much to be thankful for. Let's give gratitude for the fact that we can meet as a congregation and we can live and learn together and listen to these words of wisdom. The beloved, the lover, the loving that comes from following the path of Jesus. Let us say the Lord's Prayer. We gather these and all our prayers thankful that we may turn to you as to a loving grandparent who watches over us and pray together as Jesus taught. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
Thank you, Mark, for the last couple of weeks and the services that you took before. It was very nice, very well to have you here. Next week, Reverend Bob Mutler will be here with us, and the week following, Debbie Stockdale will be here. And then from September to December, we will have Linda Hunter for those 4 months. For those of you who aren't longtime Wild Rose people, Linda was a minister here from 2002 to 2012. So we certainly welcome her back. We have a food pantry. There's a little red basket over here to put donations in, and the pantry's back in the back hallway there. It's available to anyone in need. So if you know of anyone, just have them check in with the office, and we put in touch with the people who are team that's overseeing the program. And your donations of old clothes and shoes, etc., that go in the blue bin that's outside the door down there, proceeds from that go to support that food pantry program. And we also support the one that's on 9th Avenue and Center Street. And Unison, you've been hearing a lot about Unison, formerly Kirby Center. Just want to make sure that you know that it's open to anyone who is over 50 plus area. We'll have more information in the coming weeks on the programs, but if you know of any of the programs that you would like, you can let Corinne know, Corinne at wildroseunited.ca, or speak to Linda or Corinne or myself, or you can write your wishes if programs you would like to see on. There's little pieces of paper in your pews and just put it on the collection plate. But we do need to get some indication of what this congregation would like, the programs that they would like to see running, and their participation in those. I think that's about all of the announcements. I'll be in the hall with my co-op and shoppers cards as usual, and shopping bags. We still have a supply of the insulated shopping bags that are just excellent. They're the same prices of what you pay in the store, and I think they're a lot better because they have a nice zipper closer on them. Anyway, that's my sales spill. And now, Corinne still has her weekly series on, I can't even read that from here, Feed Phil. The documentary is on Wednesday evenings, so you can check in with that, and there's information on it in the community contact newsletter that goes out, email that goes out. So an offering is an act of faith and trust. We dedicate the first portion of our wealth as a gift for the renewing and reconciling work of God, which we are called to join. Thank you so much for all you have given and will continue to give. Let us worship God with our offering. There are pew plates at the door, and on there we don't pass the plates anymore. It's just one more thing that requires people to do it. And now I think Alice is going to make everybody sing.
Hello. I was really inspired, Mark, by the message last week, and Dan asked me to take part in this part of the service. And we talked about standing up to power and storms. And one of the biggest storms and power was the civil rights movement in the 60s in the United States and somewhat in Canada too. And one of the songs that came out of that was If I Had a Hammer. And I would just love if you would join in with me and bring out your inner 60s beads and long hair, and let's just give her.
I
please join in the doxology. What can I do? What can I bring? What can I say? What can I sing? I'll sing with joy. I'll say a prayer. I'll bring my love. I'll do my share.
Now we get to leave this place empowered by the Word of God that was expressed through Jesus Christ and given to you all through the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Please join me for the closing hymn, Go Forth with God, Voices United 418, verse 2.